Welcome to Call to the Land. I'm Rob Havard, and today my guest is Chris Smaje. Hi, how you doing, Chris?
Hi Rob.
Lovely to see you. How you doing?
Yeah, good. Yeah, nice to be here. Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Thanks for coming up. Really glad you come. I'm really excited about today. Someone I've followed for a while. Really enjoyed your work, and particularly the focus on, I guess, sort of land rights and opportunities and I guess the positive story of what could be as well. But I thought before we get into all of that and your 3 books that we've got here and the latest one, we should say, Finding Lights in a Dark Age, available now everywhere, I think.
Thanks for the plug.
No problem. But yeah, just to talk a bit about your background, you're an author, academic social scientist in background and a farmer as well, and just where all that started from you and how you got into it.
Good question. I mean, like a lot of people, I grew up in a sort of semi-suburban, semi-rural kind of background, farming. Don't have a farming background. It was sort of going on, in the background without me being that aware of it. And then, I went to university in London, studied anthropology, and I suppose I got interested at that point in looking at kind of big global history, the sort of peasant farming globally, and the way that peasants sort of historically got co-opted and moved off the land, and all of that stuff. So I had this very sort of academic intellectual interest. I didn't actually know anything about farming, what peasants actually did. But then it was sort of in the late 90s, I sort of worked in like academic type settings, but then people started talking about climate change and energy futures in the 90s, and I started homing in a bit more on food and farming as like a really key aspect of that. And then, long story short, I suppose I was a bit disillusioned with the sort of mainstream academic life, so my wife and I took this crazy punt and bought a little bit of land in Somerset.
Lovely.
And eventually, we started running a small market garden. So, I worked full time as a grower. We run a little local veg box scheme. Did that for about 5 years, but like most things, particularly small scale organic horticulture, it's hard to make it work financially.
Sure.
And so that drew me back into thinking about, everyone's very positive about all this, regenerative farming, organic horticulture, whatever particular focus, but nobody can really make it work that easily. So I'm like, why is that? And so that sort of drew me back into, I don't have any kind of academic status. I'm a sort of lone hand really, but it kind of drew me back into writing and trying to think about it, particularly I guess in the context of what people call the polycrisis or the meta crisis, that the way that we do things now I think is not going to be the way of the future, and farming and land use is going to loom larger again in people's lives. So trying to do that now by design, so it doesn't happen in worse ways by default in the future, is sort of what I'm trying to channel in those books.
It seems like as well, like the most powerful corporations in the world at the moment, interestingly, are really focused on wanting to own agricultural land as well. So they're your projection that farming and the land use is going to become increasingly important. Like that's something that they obviously recognise. Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing everything they can to get their hands on it.
Yeah, it kind of that is manifesting in all sorts of different ways. It's partly corporate agriculture worldwide. Sort of overproduction of commodity crops on tiny margins. Wherever you can, and then there's a lot of financial wealth in the system, so you get the sort of Bill Gates or the James Dysons of this world, for all sorts of potentially different reasons, but kind of wealth ultimately finds its way back to land,
Yeah.
and so there's that kind of process going on as well. So it is, it's a tricky one in some ways, because the future that I'm writing about looks like almost the opposite of what's happening at the moment, which is, more farm concentration, more big scale farming, more corporate control of the food and farming sector. And that may be the way it goes long term, but I think there's all sorts of cracks in that facade, and hopefully possibilities for people to chart a different path. But we need to be thinking about these issues of where does our food come from and who owns the land, which sort of tend to get a bit buried in the existing system.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, isn't it, that quite often there's there's a sort of a pressure applied to, if you're saying that there could be a different way of doing things, you almost expect it to then map out exactly how it's going to look, which is not something that's then applied to the corporate potential model, which, because it's the future and it's considered progress or modernity, then we don't know what that looks like. But you could almost argue there's a case to say, well, we know that more distributed capital systems have worked in the past, so we know they could work. There's almost more evidence because this has happened before.
Yeah,
you're not trying to recreate the past.
No,
you have models that have worked, so there's no reason why we couldn't have a more sort of modern take that fits our context now. That takes the good learnings from those things that worked in the past.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of difficulties. I've written all these books about the future, which is challenging, because you're bound to be wrong if you if you sort of overdo the prediction. And equally, it's very easy for the sort of stuff I'm saying to be caricatured as, you sort of want to turn the clock back to, you sort of have this romantic vision of, the good old days. And yeah, it's not about that, but as you say, it's about learning from models from the past. It's partly about getting over ourselves. We've sort of got this modern narrative that, we're on this kind of, channel my Elon Musk, we're on this route to Mars, and it's all this sort of high-tech future. And, really, I think we're in this very peculiar short period in history of, high energy, high capital. It's not the way that most people have lived historically. Yeah. Most people have figured out local, low energy, relatively sustainable local farming systems. And, it's not about doing exactly what they did in the past, but learning, what constraints were they working under, how did they figure things out, and, can we learn from that in terms of what we do today? So yeah, that's that's kind of what I'm trying to channel in these books.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting when you talk about that, those small scale solutions, which actually with technology that offers us an opportunity to do more small scale solutions in many ways, but it's not in the interests of those who would like to essentially have more power in order to receive more of the income, or put a rent on it or whatever. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, a lot of this is sort of about decommodification, or in farming context, historically worldwide there's been this huge pressure to sort of focus on what is going to deliver the most comparative advantage, the sort of biggest income stream, not how people can generate a kind of agreeable local lifestyle. So yeah, that is one big part of the problem. And as you say, I suppose I didn't answer your previous question. The other aspect of this is people then kind of want me, or want these kinds of arguments to have some blueprint for the future, which I'm very resistant to do, partly because we are in this polycrisis that is going to manifest in lots of different ways, but you can't really tell that will pan out. But as you said, it's not as if the existing system has been smoothly planned and implemented. I mean, it kind of has in some ways, in terms of the way that economic power has extended around the world and kind of broken local systems, but that has emerged, over a long period through a lot of trial and error and contingencies. It wasn't a few people in a smoke-filled room figuring it all out.
No, it's maybe people in powerful situations trying to collect more power or hold on to it, and then the goal is there, and it's like that old saying where if you look at a plane journey, when it takes off, it knows what the destination is, but it has to make something like 3,000 adjustments across the flight. And so for those people who know they want more centralized power, centralized control, then they're going to try things that don't work, but ultimately then they're redirecting back to their original aim.
Yeah.
And so it's also, like you say, it's interesting how vulnerable those systems are, or even that direction is, to all sorts of things actually.
Yeah.
And I think one of the most things that it's vulnerable, and I think it's empowering, is that actually just people taking steps on their own to step outside of that system and find alternatives. And that's actually what this podcast series is really about in many ways. We've talked to quite a lot of farmers, often first-time farmers, who have built really profitable, either organic or regenerative farming businesses, like really profitable. And if we can collect together some of the learnings that people are doing all the time, that maybe are not part of what corporate agriculture is doing, but actually small family farms can be really profitable, and these people have done it. If we can learn that and replicate it, build it into culture over long term, then...
Yeah, it sounds like I need to learn a bit from some of your other guests. But yeah, I mean, there's lots of ways in which people can sort of find their way around the existing obstacles, and it's sort of, but we're going to face this, more and more problematic situations, I think, of, where the mainstream system, the food system, sort of energy and economic systems are not serving people. I mean, that's increasingly becoming obvious, and we're going to need to pick up the pace of that kind of people autonomously looking for alternatives. And it's not, I think we've inherited this bad trend from the politics of the recent past, which is quite sort of all or nothing. It's kind of big revolutionary overthrows from below, or sort of big corporate domination 100%. From above, and actually there's a much greater complexity of the way that people can sort of navigate through that. And that's why I think I can't talk about all of that in my writing, and no one person can sort of channel all of that. It's about just amplifying those possibilities and doing what we can do within our individual situations to amplify that kind of positive sense of local autonomy and resilience and decommodification.
Yeah, and in your first book, you talk particularly about how smaller farms can be a part of that, and in terms of access to land with regard to that, and actually, because as you say, people discount that small farms can be more productive, and there's an assumption also that modern systems are more efficient. But I think it's like, how do we define efficiency? And I think we were talking the other day, because Lizzie, my wife-to-be, she lives up in Shropshire Hills. So farms at about 1,000 feet. It takes about 10 minutes just to get to the local village. Now, the other day we were there at the weekend, and I dread to say publicly, but there were, because of the Amazon thing, I think there were 7 van deliveries up to that single farm in one day. And now we're supposed to believe that all the logistics and the cleverness of our modern distribution system is state of the art. But are we really saying that 7 trips to that farm in one day with 7 different vans and 7 different drivers is more efficient than one Royal Mail van turning up each morning and the postie knowing the people there and being part of the community. Like, is that really progress?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's right. Efficiency is one of these words that gets bandied around, and it can mean a lot of different things. But essentially, it means the least cost way of reaching an outcome, a desired outcome.
Yeah.
But obviously, we need to talk about what is the desired outcome. What are we trying to achieve, and how do we measure cost? And as you say, within your Amazon van example, we tend not to think about energy cost because we've grown up in and still live in a system where there's just this abundant cheap energy, and that's where the older farm systems where there wasn't abundant cheap energy become interesting models. In a world where energy is dear, how do we then live? And one of the problems, I guess, is that all of the old systems that used to be supportive of a local agrarian rural life have been hollowed out. Villages without shops or schools or other infrastructure because it's easier to jump in a car and drive a few miles to the supermarket, and all of those systems. So that is a problem that we now face. But there is this problem of the way that we talk about efficiency and optimization, and there's so many examples. Large scale farming and the optimization of huge combine harvesters or something. At one level it might be more efficient, but you have to look at efficiency and cost are two very different things. In
order to grow feed wheat, which at 4 tonnes to the acre, and then you go back to Victorian cottage garden. I've seen people in Victorian times growing like 40 tonnes of produce per acre off a cottage garden. So if we're talking about 10 times the productivity 100 years ago, and again we call this efficiency or progress, but then if you add in, I think I heard that we were talking earlier, there's on the news today, I think Amazon have just slashed 16,000 jobs from middle management because AI automation is going to take those jobs away. So there's going to be a problem of like, where's this meaningful work coming from? But if you apply that work to small farms that maybe if they can't times 10 productivity, but if you can double productivity, then the world population, all these sorts of stuff people worry about, all those problems go away. So well, there's an irony there in what you've just said, in that the narrative in farming has always been getting jobs out of farming, that it's some kind of progress. Great, we've removed these agricultural jobs and people have gone off to the cities or the factories, and whereas in other sectors, particularly industry, we talk about it's great, we've created new jobs here, but as you've said, there is a kind of overproduction and an overcapacity in industry now, as well as in agriculture, and all sorts of ways in which jobs there are being kind of automated out. And so there's definitely scope for creating job-rich agricultures, and that's the other side of it is, as you say, like the cottage garden, that there is this assumption that people make that modern agriculture is more efficient, and really what that boils down to is it produces more output, particularly more saleable output per unit labour, but not per unit energy, not not per unit acre. More or less every other consideration, it's less efficient, and ultimately those are the things that are going to be more important. And also externalised costs. So we all pay our water bill and pretend that's a private enterprise. It's really nationalised, really. And we're paying to clean up all the waterways.
No, I mean, externalised costs.
These chemical companies are causing, they're not taxed.
Absolutely. Externalised costs in terms of nature damage and climate change and all the rest of it. Health.
People.
And also, you were talking about, for example, the postie compared to the Amazon drivers. There's a kind of intangible benefits of community there that, again, it's easy to say that this is all romantic and nostalgic, but yeah, people actually connected, doing jobs that are connected into community and the benefits of talking. I mean, it's funny how, when you have an Amazon driver these days, they're so stressed out, having to get to their next delivery, that it's not like you ever talk to them.
0 hours contract.
Compared to, I remember the guy retired recently, but ran a little farm supply store in my town, and you'd go in and you'd be hard to get out, in less than an hour. And so on the one hand, we talk about, that was then, and we now need this efficiency in output. But the larger problem in the world we have is overproduction of the wrong kinds of commodities, really, and that's what's driving so much misery and pollution and sort of excess capital that's sort of bouncing around all the systems, causing havoc. And so another lesson that you can look at from older agrarian societies is ways of not accumulating too much capital, ways of burning capital. Other people like David Fleming have written about this in terms of carnival, feasts and sort of various ways of, let's just step back from this and have a bit of fun instead. And I think that is an important focus as well. That
well, what's fruitful is kind of that, and that's a different thing, isn't it? Like is a more holistic view of what a person needs. And at a time when one of our biggest health crises is too much food, is obesity, or too much calories, then those human connections you talk about with the postie become even more important.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of problems with, some of the dysfunctions of the food system manifest in a lot of people having too much food and obesity, and also other people having not enough. And generally there is an overproduction that drives prices. There's a kind of race to the bottom in global food markets that doesn't really benefit anybody except the corporations that are providing the inputs for it. It's interesting that you contrasted corporations with people, which is interesting because technically, legally, a corporation is a person, but that is one of the big problems we have, that corporations never die, and they don't have that kind of rounded. They have an economic bottom line, which, of course, people individually, we have economic bottom lines, but we have a lot of other aspects to our character and as well, in terms of what constitutes a good life, people that we interact with. And one of the problems we've had is that history of the slow creation of a corporate world in which there is no place for that. That is a big part of the problem.
I forget who it is who wrote about that, saying that corporations effectively act like psychopaths. And so we just create these psychopathic entities that kind of, they just lose that. And also the fact that there's no proximity to the impact of decisions. So humans will become sort of quasi-semi-psychopathic, or certainly not empathic when they're in a situation where they just don't see.
Well, that's right. Yeah,
we all buy a smartphone.
Yeah,
but we probably, part of us knows what's happening in the Congo.
Yeah.
So.
No, that's right. There's no feedback, and also political systems increasingly, advance psychopaths to run them. There's Luke Kemp has written this book about Goliath's curse, where he sort of talks about that our politics produces these slightly unhinged characters, and that's part of the problem that we have. In natural ecosystems, you get the Goliaths, you get the big stuff, but there's a lot of checks and balances and countervailing forces. And
David comes along with a sling.
Exactly, yeah. Whereas part of the problem we have now is that we've eliminated the possibility for Davids. I mean, I know, as you were saying earlier, there still are some, but we've got this kind of corporate and governmental sort of relationship in lockstep, that, and you know, people have written interesting. Glenn Davis Stone's written this great book, The Agricultural Dilemma, where he kind of talks about the modern global agricultural systems as essentially being a pipeline for funneling public money into the coffers of private corporations through routes like, you know, the whole fertilizer industry, the whole sort of green revolution type of, you know, input intensive ways of supposedly increasing the efficiency, but really it's, you know, it's kind of increasing yield responses in relation to inputs, and you know, a lot of questions about how that has manifested, whether that's actually been a benefit to humanity. So yeah, you know,
and that a lot of that comes down to governance as well. I think in a sort of past life I ran a national charity and had run other charities, and governance is, within charity sector is seen as vital and vitally important, rightly so. And then we look at our sort of political situation and kind of end up throwing away some really important governance principles because either we don't like the people who are currently in power, or the things we want to happen aren't happening, or whatever. But that really potentially weakens us, and it makes us susceptible to people taking more power, you know, from us, and then these sorts of outcomes just tend to be what happens as well. And
yeah, I mean, we need a more complex understanding of how political power works, and you know, we have these sort of mass systems with simplistic solutions, you know, that increasingly are not serving us well, or never really did serve most people well, you know.
But the bigger they get, the more bureaucratic they get, the less human they get, and I think that can, that leads to those sorts of decisions. And
yeah, I mean, there's a lot of perverse incentives when, you know, whenever you try and create a kind of bureaucratic solution that sort of supposedly fits all, you know, people. For one thing, people then figure out ways of gaming it, and it tends to be the people that can game it, you know, bigger and bigger sort of scale stuff. But also, it can never really respond to the complexity of, you know, fine-grained local complexity. So that, generally, I think it's good to, to trust people bottom up to create systems that work for them, rather than, you know, trying to micromanage everything from the centre. So,
well, like you say, and if like a greater and greater proportion of the tax take is then spent on, say, debt interest, it's going out of the country to, essentially it's just, like almost like a vampire sucking that out. And it's so just, again, having that thought about some basic principles, which might be that you might want to try and avoid running a deficit and building up debt, which puts that liability on future generations and sucks money out of the economy and out of people's potential to invest in their future. And
yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of ways in which the economy does work vampirically, you know, particularly for poor people and poor countries. But, you know, I guess we've, going back to the earlier part of the conversation, there's, really I see there's a kind of long run global political history of, essentially Europe trying to connect with the rich economies of Asia and sort of discovering, quote unquote, the Americas in the process. And that, that led to this huge smash and grab raid on the Americas that sort of connected Europe with China and India. And, we've had this, for hundreds of years, that has set the terms of the global economy with, initially the European colonial powers, now more so, the United States, but, that's beginning to fall apart. And it's been this kind of huge pump of resource and finance from local areas, and some more than others, sort of into this global system that has generated benefit for enough people for it to kind of seem like, oh great, capitalism, globalization, modernism, what's not to like about it? But ultimately it's not sustainable, and it is in many ways storing up well, I mean, it always has created huge problems for many people, but it's storing up problems for all of us in the future. And I think the solution is not, again, in terms of your question about alternative blueprints, the solution is not to sort of confront it head on and say, hey, I've got a better blueprint for how this is going to work globally, because there isn't one. It's got to be about local responses and a more, you could talk about David and Goliath, or maybe a more cunning sort of way of finding your way to alternative ways of doing things.
Well, I like that about the title of your last book, so Finding Lights in a Dark Age, because initially I thought, what's he mean by that? But I think it's an interesting idea that actually, first of all, the Dark Ages maybe weren't that dark. That it was quite an agrarian lifestyle. Obviously, the monasteries were being built. There's a very massive sort of growth of Christianity within the country at that point, as markets local, internal, but not trade routes. And because we didn't have the trade routes, a lot of it wasn't captured or talked about. But then again, that sort of idea that we might be entering another Dark Age, but all of what was built during the Dark Ages, which kind of led into the future, again, this is a potential to kind of fertilise and encourage these ideas, these trials, see what works. How can we look at what works in the future? I mean, I kind of like that, because it's easy to look at the future and just see quite a lot of negative. But actually to see, well, if we're going to have a Dark Age, we could make it a really good Dark Age.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to play with that Dark Age idea in the book, for a couple of different reasons that you've already alluded to. I mean, one is that, we've been talking about these big political systems, and some people are like, oh, it's all right, we can techno-fix our way out of this, with low carbon renewable energy, or high tech fixes in the food system or wherever, and basically I don't think we can. We don't have any simple answers or any feasible answers from sort of getting where we are now to retaining the kind of high energy, high capital global political economy that we now have. So I think it's going to fall apart in various largely unpredictable ways that are not necessarily going to be great for a lot of people. But nevertheless, if we do look at past Dark Ages, the collapse of the Roman Empire or whatever, as you say, they were not that bad for most ordinary people,
And took a long time.
They took a long time.
It wasn't like that.
No, it wasn't, and it varied, from place to place. And what's come down to us is the sort of elite, literate voices saying, "Oh my God, the Rome has been sacked. This is terrible."
Yeah.
But for a lot of people, the Rome was always a predatory colonial power. It's like, great, Rome's been sacked. No more oppressive taxes, no more sort of being press ganged into into the army. I mean, I do think we face bigger problems now in that in the past, most places still retained, most people were still on the land. There was a kind of a basic local agrarian production was the building block of past empires. We don't have that now by and large, and so the future that we face is potentially more challenging. But I think the same thing applies. We can build local resilience. We can create local markets as opposed to global commodity markets. All of those things you were talking about still apply. So there is light to be found.
And I think there's a real growing interest in our traditional crafts, countryside crafts. People who come to work for us, young people who work in our business, who are maybe not from a farming background, but they're learning to hedge lay, and they're loving this connection it gives you. And just on the farm here, like my great grandfather came here a long time ago, but there's hedges that I've laid on this hedge, and when I come to see the hedge, I can see the pleach cut that my great grandfather made.
Right.
And then a bit further on, I can see the pleach cut my grandfather made. And then I can see what my dad and then I've done. And I can see all of that in a hedge. And these sorts of intangible links to the land, a sense of place of where you're from, and like these create real depth of culture and of, you know, sometimes this is quite tough. Like people, we could say all these people come from an urban setting and work on the land, but there's quite a transition of it's a different life, and sometimes those little nuggets of meaning are what help you persist when it's rains for 3 months and you're covered in shit and whatever. But you know, these things are what hold community together as well.
Yeah.
And
yeah, I mean, it can be a tough life, but also, you know, historically, urbanization and industrialization has also been a really tough life. You know, the options for most people out of farming have generally been pretty disastrous. And as you say, you know, we in a country like Britain, you know, most of us have grown up in relative plenty, but nevertheless, I think there is that. I agree that there's a sense from a lot of young people, or a lot of people in general, that actually we've lost something. You know, we've maybe gained some things, but we've lost things as well. And I mean, that's a great example. Your hedging example, you know, of real connection to a tradition, and you know, it maybe has its downside in terms of generational issues on the farm, but that's sort of what we need to be wrestling with, rather than assuming that, you know, we can just sort of buy our way out of it with, you know, with cheap energy or commodities. And I think it's sort of interesting that, you know, my parents were sort of you know, born just before the war, grew up in this period of great post-war economic growth and, you know, the space age and everything, and I think their generation was very much like, oh, you know, all those old skills are irrelevant now, you know, we're moving into this bright space age future. But I think people growing up now, that very obviously is not the case, Elon Musk notwithstanding, you know. So I think there is an interest in reconnecting with those skills and traditions, and, you know, which is a really encouraging sign. I mean, that is something that, you know, we all need to help as much as possible, I think.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me that those have not been more valued here. You definitely on the continent you see, you know, public or state support for those cultural practices a lot more. They really look to safeguard them and look after them in many ways. But over here is you know, I worked as a professional ecologist for a long time since I graduated as well, and then built the farm when I came back to the family farm. And so I've always had an interest in ecology and as an botanist, and then I've seen the environmental movement as well really change from one that was working with landowners to one that almost wanted to kind of just take over from them. And then we've got almost in a weird colonial mindset way where I think in one of your books you call it, is it like eco-modernism sort of outlook, and like you could put rewilding into that. And I just wonder on your take on that, because you wrote quite extensively on that.
I mean, the first part of your point about Britain I think is interesting, and I mean I haven't, you know, I don't necessarily have a brilliantly worked out answer, but I think Britain, we industrialised very early. You know, we've been a basically urban society for a long time, and that was part of, you know, Britain was an early global colonial power that drew in, you know, if we want to talk about sort of capitalism and so on, you know, great book by Sidney Mintz, Sweetness and Power, you know, slavery-based sugar production as a way of subsidising the industrial revolution in Britain, you know. So we've been alienated for a very long time from those kind of smaller scale local, you know, if you want to call it peasant sort of farming traditions, whereas other parts of Europe, although they also, you know, became wealthy capitalist countries, it was later and more sort of top down. So there's still more of a sense of a local food culture and local farming cultures, you know. So there's that. In terms of
and there's something in that as well. I heard, I think Belloc talks about the impact of the dissolution of the monasteries,
right? Yeah.
Which really changed culture very quickly, because that having that power within the country, and particularly often in the countryside, that was a power that challenged the crown. They kind of ran the kind of local legal system to some degree. It's where the markets were. People came to the markets, and like in France, often those sort of monastic centres are where they have these areas of collaboration where the farmers actually work together, believe it or not, and they, you know, group buy and they group sell, and there's a lot more cooperation from that historic system. Whereas over here, because that was just swept away, and a lot of that gone, that it's just interesting, the cultural echoes from that, isn't it?
I mean, I think there's a lot of interesting issues about the power centres and how they interact with each other, and you know, some people would argue that, you know, the Norman conquest in Britain, although it was a millennium ago, it kind of cast forward a lot into the nature of our politics, and likewise with
in terms of the feudal nature of
sort of centralised political power, and the and you know, historically you get a whole bunch of interesting things between, you know, the sort of centralising royal power and, you know, more distributed sort of aristocratic power, and like you say, monasteries. I mean, Belloc arguably was a little bit misty-eyed about the way monasteries work, but nevertheless, you're right that they, you know, that there are sort of countervailing sources of generating local power that you often get within those systems that are not driven by a kind of central monarchy. So yeah, for sure.
Or at least just the impact of, because obviously the Pope and Rome through the monasteries was a big influence and a very powerful one. But just the fact of that, the kind of not having the monopoly on power. So just even just cutting power in half has a positive impact. And and even that's, so it's not great that you've still got this incredibly powerful thing in the monasteries maybe, but it's still better than if you just got a singular thing. Absolutely.
Which kind of, in a roundabout way, relates to the second part of your question, and the sort of eco-modernism, because you know, it's a real, you know, it's very unfortunate, I think, that, you know, farmers have been pushed historically just to sort of crank, you know, towards productivism, you know, just to sort of crank out maximum output and don't worry about anything else, don't worry about nature. And then it's sort of, we got into this sort of contemporary move where it's like, oh, look at all these awful farmers who, you know, who haven't looked after their land and haven't looked after nature, and it's like, well, you know, what did you expect? You know, what was asked of them, and you sort of, like you say, there is a way of trying to engage with farmers and the landscape, and sort of, you know, farmer to farmer extension agents and all that kind of thing. But the way it's gone is more this technocratic, you know, let's solve the problems of the food. You know, we don't even need farms. We can, you know, we can rewild the whole country and, you know, produce food. I mean, that was my second book, Saying No to a Farm-Free Future, was along those lines. This sort of argument that, you know, there are sort of levels and levels within it. Some of it I'm sympathetic to. I mean, having more wildness, I'm sure as an ecologist you would support that, is important, but, you know, we can have to a greater or lesser degree rewilding. You know, we don't need to be producing vast amounts of soy and beef in the Amazon, you know, the way that sort of global commodity food systems work has been disastrous, but there is that sense of technocratic centralized control, you know, within these kinds of new and environmentalist narratives, you know, that we can solve this problem with technocratic means and sort of get people off the land, and the land will be better off, and you know, there's so many, you know, it doesn't work at a technocratic level. I mean, I've gone into more depth than anyone should ever want to in terms of the sort of energetics of so-called precision fermentation, you know, like manufactured bacterial food. You know, it doesn't stack up. But even if it does stack up, there's a whole bunch of questions there about what, you know, what would that world look like? Would it ultimately generate a good life for people? and would it in fact protect nature? Those are not really answered within the eco-modernist framework. So
but also your background or your initial starting point in anthropology, because what you just said there is they look at the environment or that rewilded area and say, well, if we just get rid of the people. Whereas all of your books are like your focus, and I think all of our focus should be like, how can we have people solve these problems? And what about the people that live there? Because this idea of, taking over tens of thousands of acres, dispossessing all the people, and then moving them up to somewhere they don't, where to go where and to do what. And then this sort of neo-colonial feudalist idea that they can work for us. They can be park rangers, or it's almost comical, the allegories of what they try and propose. But
I mean, there's so many reasons why it doesn't work, and sort of turning the countryside into a theme park, and sort of being very, very dismissive of that accretion of knowledge and sort of agrarian history. Is problematic. I mean, I think Carwyn Graves, he's written this great book, Tyr, about what's it called, the history of the Welsh landscape. And I mean, he's done great work on all of this, but it sort of gets forgotten so quickly. I mean, he's done interesting work about fruit orchards in Wales, and the way that there used to be a sort of mixed local food systems in Wales, that then as we were talking earlier, the way that global food systems work is they just push every region to produce the one or the handful of things that they can advantageously sell into global commodity markets, which in upland Wales is basically sheep. So you have too many sheep in the Welsh uplands, and all of that other mixed infrastructure or mixed landscape use disappearing. And Carwyn's work, where he's looked at old Welsh orchards, and people say to him, we can't grow fruit in Wales, and he's like, yes, we can. I can show you where the orchards are. But the people, memories are short. People forget that there is that possibility of diversity, and as his work shows very nicely, it's almost like you can have wild biodiversity almost as a byproduct of people just creating a sort of diverse agricultures to serve local needs, not to serve global market needs, because it creates an inherently sort of mosaic, diverse kinds of landscapes in which all sorts of wild organisms can find their place. So we need to, I think, be much more into that kind of agri-rewilding way of thinking than this, again, this kind of solutionism, this kind of techno, let's solve this and just get the hell out of of local places and rural agrarian places. I just think that's it doesn't stack up technically anyway, but even if it did, it's just the wrong way of thinking. That that goes back to the alienation you were talking about earlier, really, that we just don't really know where the stuff we're using comes from, and that would be all the more the problem.
Yeah, and it makes me think about Lizzie, my wife's done a lot of work in Uganda.
Right.
She runs a charity, supports school out there, and she visits a lot. And what's lovely when you go there is to see the fairly simple housing, but each place has got more or less 1 or 2 acres to it, or a little, some a bit more, some a bit less. But because it's tropical climate and it's cropping all year round, multiple crops a year, loads of amazing fruit, and then all the vegetable matter. You're watching them, like some of the permaculture stuff you see with like harvesting manure and rabbit cages of Joel Salatin. They've got rabbits in cages eating forage, and the manure's dropping out, being collected in little drain pipes, which then taken out to the coffee trees and the banana trees. And the pigsties have got all sloping floors. They're collecting and then the pigs go out and forage, and they come back, and then the cattle are going out, coming back, they collect the manure. Nothing is wasted, and they've got incredible circular systems. And like you do, I've done permaculture courses over here, and you're sort of learning all this stuff. It's like, oh, aren't we clever coming up with all this stuff? And it's like they're complete. This has been going on for generations and generations there. But one of the saddest things that's happening over there at the moment, and again, if we call this progress, so you've got people who are well fed and good community. Funeral, someone dies, 1,500 people turn up. Every single, the incredible community values over there, and but what's happening is palm oil's coming in, and there's people being bought off. The state is being bought off because roads, hospitals, schools might get built by the palm oil companies, and if you haven't got title, if you haven't got a piece of paper, then they'll just take your land. People are being potentially murdered for that, and so this community of small-scale farms just being swept away so that we can have a cheaper version of oil that saves a corporation a load of money, and it's oil that doesn't do us any good anyway. It causes a health problem.
Yeah,
and that's progress.
Yeah, I mean it's really important to to discuss examples like that, because it goes back to the earlier part of our conversation. People do generate well-being and meaning in their lives locally. It's not that hard to do. It's probably easier to do in Uganda, climate-wise, or at least it is at the moment. And who knows longer term. I mean, similarly, I was on a farm study trip in Nicaragua, and it was I was so jealous people were growing citrus trees in the shade of a coconut palm because it was too sunny to grow the citrus, in the sun. But these systems can be enormously productive, and they get swept away by this larger economic connection, and that then gets presented to us as progress and you're romanticizing this other way of being. Well, no, it's not that those local societies are without their problems or whatever, but we just need to not buy into this story that sort of process of hollowing out, creating single commodity crops, is an unalloyed good. It isn't, and it creates so much social and ecological damage that so it is about defending, talking about property rights, talking about food sovereignty, talking about community rights to determine their own futures, not have them determined for them. Absolutely.
Yeah. Have you come across Paul Kingsnorth's stuff and
yes,
his sort of the idea of the machine? Yes,
I just wrote a review on my blog actually of his of his Against the Machine book. Yeah. So, there is I mean, I think it's a very interesting metaphor in lots of ways. It is this kind of, and as he points out in that book, it's not entirely new. This sort of element. Humans, part of our superpower is almost to sort of conform and copy each other and invent these sort of modular systems, and we've been doing that. Since the year dot really, but it's amplified massively in modern times and sort of to the point that we're threatening our own survival really. So it's an interesting book.
I think it's interesting as well from the point of that idea of the machine, because it's kind of machine thinking. It's not human. It's almost anti-human, which is a bit like the rewilding is kind of anti-human because we need to get rid of the humans. And it's that just that thought, and it's not a new concept either, because if you think, I think Tolkien wrote a lot about that too, didn't he? How actually Lord of the Rings is basically the creation of the orcs, and which is kind of the genetic engineering, and that was kind of industrial machinery versus this sort of bucolic, the
I have to confess, I'm a bit. I'm one of the few probably that hasn't read or watched Tolkien, but I know, I know that it's been influential on Paul, and
is that right?
There is that dimension, and it's I mean, another larger context for it is the whole history of the grain states. I mean, people like James Scott have written about that interestingly, and the the way that you get a kind of centralized state based on essentially monoculture of a cereal and or grain legume, and then a lot of resistance to that with much more smaller scale mixed cropping sort of around the margins of empire, but that we've now almost got into this sort of global grain state, and it's problematic, and it is a kind of based on a sort of monocultural thinking,
and then in terms of how that smaller farms that you talk about towards the end, are you talking about distributism within the last book? And in terms of that, like distributed capital, I think one of the interesting things, and something you said earlier as well, about how we've kind of had two models, which is this sort of capitalistic centralizing model, or you just have to have a revolution which overturns everything and throws the baby out with the bathwater and you lose all the good stuff. But I think as well, the other side of that is that you've got this sort of oligarchical plutocracy, which is just trying to centralise capital and power. But then the opposing force to the centralisation of power then has, sadly, I think, been Marxism and communism, which is also tries to centralise power.
Yeah,
and although it talks about redistribution, and the fact that distributism was, at the time of the Industrial Revolution, when all the criticisms of capitalism came, there was an alternative that was quite widely spoken, and I think Pope Leo XIII, Rerum Novarum, wrote about this alternative of distributed capital, and then Chesterton and Belloc sort of expanded on that a little bit, or worked from that basis. But it's just interesting, isn't it? I guess, well, perhaps it's not surprising that the thing that would actually distribute capital, because the socialist states don't distribute capital, they might distribute revenue, but they never distribute capital. And whereas that might be the solution, actually, because if you don't have capital, or if capital is distributed properly, then you don't have the same power.
And that's so it's the conjoint, it's distributed capital and also distributed political power, and like you say, we've had the sort of communist revolutions that have rightly been articulated against too much oligarchic power, but have tended just to replicate it. That ultimately it's another form of the machine. And so I
think Belloc called them both the servile state.
Yes. So there is that interesting history of distributism, and there was this whole period from the sort of mid-19th through to the mid-20th century that was really alive with a lot of agrarian ideas and ideas about different ways of thinking about access to land, different ways of thinking about farming, and it's all sort of got a bit kind of buried in this kind of left-right or sort of capital versus labour thing. And one of the ironies, I suppose, of communism was that Marx, understandably at the time, thought that revolution would come in the most industrialised. It would be sort of landless wage labourers, the proletariat, that would generate revolution, whereas all the big communist revolutions actually happened in agrarian peasant countries, Russia, China, Vietnam. But that sort of peasant communalism was essentially co-opted by a sort of centralised kind of machine politics. And so that kind of distributist idea is neither capitalism nor socialism. It's about ordinary people having access to the means of production to sort of insulate themselves from those big kind of machine type economies and politics, and also having autonomy. Subsidiarity is that idea that it's that power doesn't only emanate from the centre, it can also emanate from other sources in family and community and commons and so on. I think they're really important ideas.
Well, I think the machine allegory is really good in that sense, particularly because essentially if you're disempowered in a capitalist system and you're living month to month, and whatever you earn is taxed to a point that you can just about get by, and everything else is extracted. But then in a communist system or a socialist system whereby the state does all the charity, it removes the human charity, doesn't it? I think, and then you've lost those single acts from one person to another that actually are what bind and build community.
Yeah.
So it is a machine versus a human thing, I think, as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I've got a colleague from the Czech Republic who sort of has this kind of interesting story. I think it was his grandfather who was a small farmer, you know, after the communists took over post-war, and who, you know, he wanted to continue to be a small farmer, but it was really hard, you know, to do that, and everything was shaped into collective farms, which his narrative was like all the lazy people join the collective farm, and then it's like great, there's almost like that joke of the communist collective farm that we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us kind of thing. There's that very sort of
there's the tragedy of Boxer in Animal Farm,
right?
Isn't it?
Yeah. But very sort of alienated mode of existence, and there are power relations within small-scale local farm societies, but that's, like you say, there's a kind of throwing out the baby with the bathwater kind of thing where, the idea is sort of sweep all that away. There is a need, I think, to and that's the distributist idea that I think is a powerful one. It's not a kind of it's not a sort of capitalist idea of sort of a cumulative private property by which you can dominate other people. It's the idea that if you have access to a small bit of land, if you're part of a guild that's serving its community, you have a self-interest in doing a sort of good job for yourself and for your community, and that kind of gets undermined in other ways. So I think they're important and powerful ideas.
And I guess there's an element as well that if people need to borrow money, then it almost as close to home as possible, so people can see what's happening as well. But also, if that money doesn't sit locally, if it's all in banks or if it's in London or internationally, then it's so far away from the actual point of impact. And I think also just from you mentioned about having that sort of security. I think it's really sad when something like a distributed system, or just the principle of private property itself, is seen as the evil rather than the accumulation of too much. Whereas, because from a charity point of view, when I was running a charity, one of the principles is that you should always have at least 6 months, hopefully 12 months of reserves in place, so you can run the charity if you don't get any income. And I think farming's a really similar sort of situation where you could have some awful weather events, disease, there's all this sort of random stuff that can happen. Is it really obscene and greedy to have 12 months of running costs in the bank? But then that could also be there, if there's a really good young farmer who wants to have a go, and she's got great ideas, but she just doesn't have access to capital yet, then that's local. You can also help with advice. Maybe instead of charging an interest usury, you could maybe be a partner in that deal and have an interest in the outcome. And all of these things, again, build more of community rather than tear it apart.
Yeah, I mean, communities need to, you need capital in order to do anything, but communities, I think, need as far as possible to generate their own, and it's not going to be as much as you can access through, sort of at a distance, concentrated routes, but that capital always comes at a price, and ultimately the price is the destruction of the local agrarian economy. You've given various examples earlier, but we get into a tangle with the notion of private property. It's partly that we have this very sort of extremist modern capitalist version, which is you can accumulate as much as you want. you can exclude any, get off my
Monopoly.
land sort of thing,
Playing Monopoly, yeah.
Yeah, and you can do what you like, you can do what you like on your land regardless of any other wider, and that private property does not have to be that extremist.
No.
But I think, again, sort of coming from the likes of Marx, which goes back to very old anthropology, like Lewis Henry Morgan writing in the mid-19th century, this notion of a sort of primitive communism where, there's this idea that before modern times everybody just sort of lived in big communities collectively and decided everything jointly. It's not really the way that most societies have operated.
No.
There's
certainly not how Marx operated himself.
Well, yes, we all have our hypocrisies, I guess, in relation to how the system works. But
true.
Yeah, no. I mean, Engels kind of enabled him to, do his thing for sure. But it's most small farm societies have an element of distributism, have an element of small scale local private property kind of set within larger kind of community ways of doing things, and we need to as we were saying, there was so much nuanced thinking about that, and there's so much that we can learn from existing agrarian societies or past ones that we tend to we're sort of modern and we don't need all of that. But people have thought about this stuff, and there's no perfect solution. There are power relations, there are problems, but that sort of sense of distributed local private property and sort of community capital generation, it's so important for us to be aware and to try and recreate that where we can.
Yeah, I think it's interesting as well. You mentioned, I think in the later book, about common land as well. And we had a guy on a few weeks ago on the podcast, Hal Morgan, who's a common rights holder on the Brecon Beacons.
Oh, right.
And a really good chat about that. And I used to run a charity on the Malvern Hills, which is about 3,000 acres. There was 14 common land units.
Right.
It was really interesting to see how that operated, because you had these individual farms that were owned, but then the rights of common were property rights linked to the farm, and even the individual fields had a sort of an allocation of this field allows you to turn out this many stock, and so on and so on. So if fields were sold, then someone else could buy the field and then have common rights. And we were talking and laughing actually, because the politics on commons, internal politics, the local politics, is just incredibly difficult. It's so hard. Like it's so hard to get anything done.
Yeah.
But there's an element that is kind of why it's persisted, because governments have come in and people have had ideas. There's always people want to have ideas about what someone else should do on their land, isn't there? But basically people look at commons and they're just like, I don't want to go near that. And that's helped them persist. And quite often the commoners would all be falling out. They wouldn't really get on with each other, but they did understand each other because they were from the same community. They did the same things. They were under the same pressures. And I think sometimes this idea of community can be it can be a bit sort of pie in the sky, all nicey, whereas that's not necessarily what community is. We've got to be comfortable with a little bit of conflict, but then resolution comes with that, and a little bit of friction can be helpful, and a little bit of spikiness can sometimes allow a tradition to be preserved and persevere over the long term. But I do think there's a model there. Like, rather, if you're going to rewild 50,000 acres, like the Brecon Beacons National Park, I think the common land unit is 28,000 acres, Hal said. So, those sorts of areas are being talked about on rewilding. So if you just put like 10, 20, sort of 50 acre, 100 acre farms around the edge of that sort of landmass and had common rights with either shared stocking, or you might not have to have, like you said earlier, we might not have to have all the answers, but some form of property right that allowed that communal operation of land. I mean, that could, it's worked in the past. Why not do something that's worked before rather than something that's never been tried?
Yeah. I mean, I totally agree with everything you've just said. That I think there's a too sort of woolly and generic an idea of commons, I think, in some of the modern thinking and writing about it, partly because it's only when you get into some of the details that you were touching on, when it is actually a working agricultural landscape, and you have to figure out exactly how it works, and historically you tend to get commons. You only get them in sort of specific circumstances where it really doesn't make sense for everybody to have their own private, like everybody having their own private woodland, woodlot to sort of generate fuel, or, grazing is when in certain kind of landscapes having collective grazing totally makes sense. But it's hard to get that, then you're drawn into having to negotiate these relationships, which is costly. It does have many benefits, and perhaps partly the sort of hidden benefit of being politically opaque and hard for other people to sort of get into. But yeah, most, if you're talking about sort of arable farming or gardening, or, it doesn't tend to be done as a commons because, it's easier just to get on with it.
Yes.
And that's kind of where the subsidiarity point with distributism comes in, is that, you design a sort of complicated system that sort of devolves power to the lowest appropriate level, and that will often be an individual or a family or a household. Sometimes it will be a commons or a guild. Sometimes it will be a bigger, more centralized power, but as far as possible you devolve to the smallest level. And when you look at commons historically, they operate around the edges. I mean, obviously depending on the landscape and the type of farming and other factors, but they tend to be a supplement rather than the driving force of agricultural communities. And we have to acknowledge the difficulties of working with other people. It's great, but it also imposes costs, time costs, and You're right, embracing conflict and is important. And I think that's another dimension to all of this, that we have to get better at conflict resolution without invoking some higher power or some detailed bureaucratic framework. But
even if it's really local, a local bureaucratic framework can be not necessarily a bad thing. In the sense that it brings people together. Like, so much of what we do now is shortcut to just pressing on the smartphone and expecting something to happen. But so almost if we don't build in those requirements to connect and negotiate and sort of communally discuss what we're going to do together or apart, then those will fall. That's the machine route, isn't it? And we lose that if we're not careful.
Yeah, absolutely. The sort of the orneriness of everyday connection, but also the positives of it. Yeah, we definitely need to build that in. Yeah, and not just invoke a higher power to sort of determine or resolve solutions for us. But yeah, definitely, as you say, to build in local agreements, that are sort of that are specific and attuned to what needs to be done locally, rather than some kind of one size fits all framework that's kind of parachuted in.
Absolutely. Well, what would you say are the main, what do you think are the simplest things that we could change or do to start moving in the right direction? If we're making an assumption that we don't have to solve everything now, but it's almost like, even with the distributed capital thing, you could have policy maybe that just headed us in that direction, that put a bit of friction on accumulation of capital, that put a bit of, but also allowed people to have enough for themselves. But
well, it's difficult because we're now in this world that is so reliant on these sort of big flows of global capital, and individual national governments don't really have, some more than others, but none of them have that much power over how that goes. But I mean, I do think starting locally, starting with community, and starting with an interest in the basics of how we live, how we generate livelihood. So food, energy, the built environment are really critical, I think, and to be aware that, I don't think these bigger systems ultimately have our interests at heart, or are going to survive, or are going to save our ass. So we need to sort of start stepping up to doing that, and conflict resolution perhaps would be the other one. And how that manifests locally is difficult, in a food and farming context, because most people aren't part of that world, and land prices are so high. But I think that is a key point where I would want local communities to start, instead of that whole rewilding, get people off the land thing. It's actually, who is producing our food? Who are the local farmers? Who owns land locally? How can we start trying to turn that land to account, in terms of producing stuff for ourselves locally, and obviously we then get into that discussion of urbanism and where people live and so on. But one thing that we have tried to do locally in various ways is do that, raise people's awareness about food and the local farmed landscape, and sort of start trying to unlock a bit of local capital. There's a lot of people of goodwill who have a little bit of money and want to do the right thing in their community, and so it's starting to can we actually find ways to use their money or their time, or whatever it might be, to access local land, or to support people doing some sort of beneficial food or fibre production. And like you say, you then quickly get into the micro politics of that, and that's where I think it's kind of interesting and important. It's like, well, who gets to make the production decisions and so. But that's where to start, I think. Or even in a highly sort of urban mega city context, there's still land, there's still sort of access to, or maybe a lack of access to food, that you can start having that conversation and start generating community gardens and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it sounds a bit feeble in the face of the sort of huge global issues that we face, but I think that's where it starts, bottom up. And the more that we start piecing that together now, the less problematic it will be when systems kind of fail, sort of in unchosen catastrophic ways.
Well, I think that's a nice place to end. And I think there's a quote from C.S. Lewis that goes something along, I'll probably screw this up, but it goes something along the lines of that one small good act, as insignificant as you think it might be, could be the outpost for the next move forwards to make the progress that needs to be made. Right. And so don't stop just because it looks forlorn or if there's not a problem. And I think your book, it's what the book's about. And I think, I just say I really appreciate your work, because I think it's important. And actually, just going back to earlier saying that Amazon getting rid of 16,000 workers, and obviously with the global political sort of military industrial complex situation that's going on in the world as well at the moment, you could look at all of this happening and think, gosh, it's all terrible. But if there is going to be a dark age, then at least there's plenty of things we can look to do to make it a better one. And I think that's a really important piece of work you've done. So thank you very much. Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, I mean, I do sometimes. I spend a lot of time writing, increasingly in the last few years, and possibly not enough time farming, or producing the food. But I do, I have had a few people contact me and say that my book has helped. It was one of the things that swayed them into actually starting a more local land-based life. And that, it feels like a small good act. So yeah, it's great to hear that from you. I appreciate it, because
all of us, we only have so much time to devote to so many different things, but part of this is about having wider conversations that sort of don't get heard too much in the mainstream, so I think it's important to do what you're doing here as well, and spread people's ideas.
No, thank you. Thanks for doing it, because I know it's a lot of work. And if you
Thank
want
you.
to get involved in the conversation, get in the comments down below. You can follow Call to Land podcast on all the usual places: Instagram, on X, everywhere else you usually expect to find us. Find us on YouTube as well. We'll reply to comments as much as we can. Stay tuned for our next episode. Thanks very much.